Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya and welcome to our yearly video prediction series. And today we have with us once again Jono Bacon, founder and CEO of Community Leadership Core. Jono, it's great to have you on the show.
It's great to be here. It's nice to see you. How are you doing?
I am doing great. Thanks for, first of all, joining me and thanks for asking. Of course,
Yeah.
I know you very well for so many years, the whole canonical Ubuntu era, and
Yep.
the community knows you, but a lot of folks may not know who are new, who are still Greenhorn developers. So quickly tell them who is Jono Bacon and what is your company all about?
I've been working in building developer engagement and communities now for about 27 years. Got involved in the early days of open source. I used to lead the community team for Ubuntu with Canonical, where we built a community of about 60 million users, about 340,000 active contributors. Then I went to XPRIZE, where we had these massive incentive competitions. The first one was a $15 million prize that challenged teams to build an Android app for a tablet that would teach kids how to read, write, and do arithmetic without the aid of a teacher, and that was open sourced. Then I went to GitHub, led developer engagement there, and then I really wanted to understand every element of the nuance and the science of how to build great audiences and communities. So I became a consultant for a number of years. But one of the things, and I worked with a couple hundred different companies, one of the things I learned there was that most consultants just kind of give people information and then that's it, right? And the actual impact of that information is really much more of a back and forth experience. So I built a company in 2023 called the Community Leadership Core. And we're kind of like a personal trainer where, we'll help people to figure out like what work will have the biggest impact. We provide regular iterative feedback and input on the work that they're doing. And then we kind of make sure we're stepping in and holding them accountable. We don't just fire and forget. And so I've been building that company for the last couple of years. So.
Thank you for sharing more info about you and your company. Now it's time for you to grab your crystal ball and share with us what predictions you have for us this year.
Yeah, so I think the first one that we're going to see is going to be what I would describe as a healthier commercialization around open source. So since the early days of open source, there's just been like a lot of different models. Like people have tried dual licensing and merchandising at one point, selling software in boxes in the early days. And I think there's been this kind of model of you start an open source project, you try to get hundreds of thousands and millions of people using it, and then you figure out how to build a business later on. And I think in many cases, this is not a particularly effective model. We actually experienced this to a certain degree in Ubuntu where, we built a really thriving community around Ubuntu, but it was so open that we almost kind of like hamstring ourselves a little bit in terms of the balance between the open source project and the company. And I'm just seeing more and more signs that, and we recommended this to our customers who are open core companies, of like, figure out what the project looks like and figure out what the company looks like and get those elements in place as clearly and as crisply as possible. Look at the difference between Canonical, for example, and Red Hat. Like Red Hat arguably built a community that had maybe a little bit less passion and fervor than the Ubuntu community, but they've built a really sustainable business around. The next one that I'm going to say is the impact of AI on how we build developer engagement and communities. I think in the early stages of AI, what we tend to see is, people using AI for things like content creation. But my view when it comes to how you build engagement and communities is that you want it to be as personalized as possible, right? So when we're working with folks, for example, we're always kind of advocating for how to build all these different channels, whether it's a blog, whether it's social media, whether it's a Discord or a forum or open source projects and GitHub. And then how do you build as many relationships out at scale as possible? And the problem is that when open source projects get to a certain size, they can't possibly be able to have that level of personal experience. There's just too many people. So, in the early days of AI, I think what we've seen is people using AI to streamline things like content creation that are very time consuming. But what I think we're going to start seeing more and more of is AI being the all-seeing kind of force, being able to spot and observe patterns in how people participate, right? So for example, with a lot of open source projects, what will happen is, a new community member will sign up, they'll start doing some work, but they'll largely go unnoticed because, there's so many people in there and the DevRel or the community manager is not seeing the work that they're doing. And now I think what we'll be able to do is use AI to spot patterns like, oh, this person joined, they contributed their first pull request, they've been a bit active on the forum. We should now have a human being reach out to them and engage with them and focus on like how to support them and guide them through the journey of becoming more and more involved. And I think that is going to have a transformative impact on these communities. The other thing I'd say there as well that relates to this, another prediction is, is just accountability around DevRel. I hear, unfortunately, from a lot of founders, horror stories of we hired this DevRel person and they didn't really do anything for a year and we had to fire them. And those stories are half true. I think in some cases, yes, DevRel people don't do anything, but I think that's the minority. I think what happens, that's the minority cases. I think what really happens is a DevRel person comes in with a very specific set of skills, and then the founder or the manager of that DevRel person doesn't really necessarily know how to manage them and how to get the best out of those departments. And I think we're now starting to see the tide turning around accountability, not just when it comes to measuring DevRel impact on the company, but also how that intersects to places like sales. You know, I've worked with a bunch of DevRel folks in the past who are like, I want nothing to do with sales. But here's the reality. The sales team making money to pay your salary. So we have to have some mechanism of bridging these different departments together. And I think it's going to result in I think there's been a bit of a boom and bust in DevRel in some ways. I think now what we're going to see is a much healthier balance, and it's going to be better for DevRel people, and it's going to be better for companies as well. So that's my third one. And then I do have one more that I'd probably say, which is I do think we're going to see open source expanding more and more into different verticals. You know, we've seen the impact of open source on infrastructure and the cloud and embedded devices to a certain degree. But I think we're going to start seeing it expanding more and more into manufacturing and into science and other areas as well. I think one of the reasons why that has typically not happened as much is because those industries have just not known how to bring this in and figure out how to implement it and how to participate. You know, a lot of my customers in the past have been people who've hired us to try and figure that out. And I think that, people want to see other people jump first. And I think that's where we're going to see more open source in those areas. And then organizations like the Linux Foundation, I think, play a really valuable role in spinning up governance infrastructure to make it easier for those different companies to kind of collaborate with each other as well. So those will be the four that I would probably pick the most. So
now, what kind of challenges you see are going to be there this year for open source communities and even organizations when they navigate through these open source? You touched upon some aspects. So let's talk about the challenges that you think will be there.
I think one of the biggest challenges is nothing honestly unique to 2025, and this is just something in general that I think we're getting better at, but we're not there, is I think building developer communities or user communities and engagement is seen as this like mysterious science, or this mysterious art form. And there is a science behind it, and there's a predictable mechanism that you can kind of apply to this, but it kind of blends together, marketing and DevRel and sales. Those three things kind of overlap. And I think the challenge is how do people balance that out and integrate that into their projects as well as into their communities. As their companies as well as their communities. So I think that's an ongoing challenge that companies face. And then how do you, if you look at how a company evaluates success, they always boil it down to a particular set of outcomes. It's usually the brand growth, it's adoption of your product or your service, or it's revenue. These are all things that are measured in numbers in spreadsheets. Whereas the value, the impact that we all love in open source is not just the numbers in spreadsheets. It's the taste, it's the tonality, it's the engagement, it's the relationships, it's the qualitative elements of it. So I think that there'll continue to be a challenge of how people take this function and integrate it into the companies. But, I think it's getting better and better and better. I think we'll also face challenges around like what is the role of openness? Like we've seen, all of the things that have been going on, with these, these business source licenses and, the balance between, raw free software and open source and source available. That is still very much in a state of flux, because I think, a lot of companies are just trying to figure out like, how do we actually build a business around it? But again, I'll go back to what I said earlier on. If you're building an open core company, you can't just focus on building the open source project and then think about the business later on. That's not how it's supposed to work. And you won't be successful if you do that. So this to me is not just about licensing. It's really about designing an actual business around the project as well. But I think that will continue to be a challenge.
Let's also explore what are the things that you would love to see happen this year, but for sure it won't happen.
The thing that I would love to see, I've always been a huge fan of AR and VR. I think there's so much potential, especially in AR, like the AR glasses, kind of like the ones that Meta have been producing, and I think that this is the future of how we're going to engage in the world. And I want to see open source be a firm foundation in that world, right? We have companies like Meta who are very much on the open source side of the fence. There's Apple who are not, as a general rule. And then you've got this litany. I mean, CES this year was filled with companies who are bringing out little prototypes and products in this area. But what I want to see is the CNCF for that world. I want to see a foundational set of projects. I mean, obviously there's Android, but Android is a pseudo open source project. It's not fully open source in the traditional sense. And I really want to see that I want to see open source be a foundational component of how we do that. But, if there's one thing that we've learned over the years is that it's hard to build open source projects around the consumer side. We see it primarily in infrastructure, but I think there's a huge amount of potential there.
Jono, thank you so much for joining me today and share these prediction challenges and of course, your own focus for this year. Thanks for great insights. And as usual, I would love to chat with you again. Thank you.
Thank you, man.